Future Politics Panel.
Yes, indeed. Well, joining us this morning, Jonathan Gibson, political commentator, and Charlie Downs, who is also a political commentator. Good morning to the two of you.
Good morning.
Right, I have to start. Coronation, did you watch it? Were you engrossed?
Watched the whole thing. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
I actually had a friend's birthday, so unfortunately I missed a bit of it, and there was religious stuff, so
right.
And I heard a lot about it.
Well, so that's a really interesting point. Just in terms of watching the coronation, will you watch it?
I'll definitely see the thing tonight. I mean, my girlfriend's actually off there with her uncle, so I'm definitely going to be tuning into that.
So you're talking about the coronation concert tonight?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so 20,000 people going to this, allegedly. I mean, I think it will be quite splendid.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very excited to see it. They've got lots of big performers there. Lionel Richie's there, Katy Perry's there. Who else is there?
I'd take that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I'll be very, I'm very excited.
Yeah, I'm more interested in Lionel Richie than Katy Perry. But let's start. I do want to touch on the coronation because it's important, and I think this sums it up, the Sunday Times, which is the dawn of the Carolean age. What were your thoughts yesterday watching that? For me, it was a perfect blend of the majesty, the history of Britain, but it was deeply sacred and very spiritual, and actually very important in terms of the monarch who wants to be defender of all faiths, so obviously the representative from God, but at the same time, he's also then head of the armed forces, so the office has enormous weight behind it. I was deeply moved, actually.
That's right. I mean, I found the whole thing to be just a grand celebration of our culture. I don't think we'd seen Britishness allowed to display itself to such an extent since the Queen's funeral, actually. And before that, I don't know when the last time would have been, but I thought it was incredible. And I think the other thing to remember is, as much as we are, in not the best place as a country right now, when the British are allowed to display themselves, the whole world stops to watch, and it's majestic and it's magnificent and magical, and I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah. What about you, Jonathan?
For me, I think a lot of people see the coronation and they see, the police everywhere, and they think, oh, okay, it's just another day. It's nothing, I don't need to go or whatever. I don't need to watch it. I've got other things to do. But I think it's a really important reminder just how lucky sort of we are to be living in this country, where we have freedom of religion. We're allowed to, speak what we want. And I think it's sort of a marker of that as well. It's a reminder to people of, how lucky we are to live in this country, to be able to practice, to be able to work here. And I think it's a really great opportunity to celebrate that sort of culture that we have and bring out, British values which we want to, highlight and showcase to the world and showcase to ourselves.
I mean, it's really interesting. When I lived abroad, I think that's absolutely right. It's not till you leave this country you realise what you've lost.
Absolutely.
Well, I remember when I was in school, I was taught that there was kind of no such thing as British values. This was during the Blair years, so this was sort of, mid-noughties. But I was...
You are young.
Yeah.
Frightening.
But it was, it was really... The sense I was given in school was that British value... It was almost like British culture was almost like the default culture, if you want. It was kind of... without any meaningful distinguishing characteristics. That culture was to be defined by the exotic, the foreign, the kind of strange. Whereas when you take a step back and observe British culture, it's as strange and exotic and particular and weird as they come.
Yeah.
We still. I mean, just this weekend has been a celebration of our tribal leader, basically this great father figure of the nation, and that's a very. I mean, I find that a deeply sort of. Yeah, tribal is the right word, I think.
Can I ask, what do you think of the change in the language? We talk about defender of all faiths.
Yes, I was certainly going to bring Jonathan in on that. How do you feel about that?
No, I think he absolutely... the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth went over, paid his respects, stayed over there, and I think it's a fantastic mark, of the inclusion that Britain has when it comes to all faiths. I think it's, a really marvellous thing. I think we very much... what we've been able to do with this coronation is very much retain the Britishness, the sort of traditional monarchy, which I think is so fantastic in terms of paying respect to our country, whilst also highlighting more recently the developments that have allowed people in Britain to all practice their faith and all practice their unique cultures, which is something that is also respected and can be included in the conversation of what is Britishness.
And of course the oil came from Jerusalem itself, didn't it? In the ampulla used on the spoon and all the rest of it. I mean, incredibly symbolic actually, and I think I want to watch it all again actually, and because I missed bits because I was working, but I really really want to actually look at it again, because I think the devil is in the detail.
Oh,
actually.
absolutely. There's some glorious moments, as we touched on earlier, and I think having a look at that to end. But it is interesting, the change in the language, not just defender of all faiths, but I come not to be served, but to serve. All that sort of thing.
Very, very interesting. Also, of course, we were instructed to pledge allegiance, and then it was reined back, wasn't it? And then we were sort of invited.
If you want to take, but it's also, I mean, it's a Christian service, if you like, is what happened, and you're talking about Protestants within the language of it. And in Christian services, people repeat things after the person who is conducting the service says, and then you do a little phrase. So that phrase can be, oh, God save the King, or whatever it happens to be, or yes we do. So I think it's all that sort of thing. It's the narrative again, though. So many of these things fall down because of the narrative and how you sell it to the general population. And if you're saying, I'm serving you, you're not serving, and you're not serving me, work on that sort of basis. But I'm not quite sure, and different religions came out on different things. Defending all faiths is quite difficult, isn't it? Because there's a conflict between that.
Well, there's plenty of. I mean, that's the story of history, is it not?
Well,
but
indeed,
I think
the cause of more wars than anything else, religion.
Quite right. But I think what the king is basically saying when he says he's defender of all faiths, that strikes me as him saying he's almost a neutral arbiter between the faiths. And I actually think that that's not. This idea of neutrality in that way is not something that's possible, as far as I'm concerned. I think you kind of need to have a basis.
Is he not defending the right to have faith?
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
Exactly, freedom of religion, the ability to, be Jewish or be Muslim, be Sikh, be Christian, whatever it is, and, still very much, I think, retained a lot of the Christian elements, which, are the foundations of our country in many ways. But, I think what I interpreted that was saying that, we can continue to allow people to practice the faith that they choose to...
So I was asked, possibly this is a very thorny issue. If Charles is defender of the faith, then which God is saving the king? I was just thinking that's really interesting. I suppose it's your God, depending on your religion.
I think the Rabbi Sachs, the late Rabbi Sachs, said and wrote that each religion speaks to different people in different ways.
Absolutely.
Clearly, I think everyone would agree that like the Christian God speaks to Christians, the Jewish God speaks to Jews, and I think everyone in their own sense would want to use their own religion and background to defend the king, and that's why the chief rabbi and other religious leaders stood up there and gave a prayer for the king, and said we want gave a blessing in order to protect him and sustain him, etc. So I think that's what he was really going for with that sort of.
It'd be interesting to hear the background to how that came about and whether he consulted the different religious.
I think it came from him.
I think the principle is absolutely right. You want a unified thing. I believe in all sorts of different things, but I just wonder if he consulted the different religious leaders.
Sure he did.
And work on that sort of basis. I would be foolhardy not to.
I mean, he has a history, doesn't he, of talking extensively to all faiths, actually, and trying to be as inclusive. And actually, for me, one of the other things, if you look at the front pages this morning, and this actually, I think, is extraordinary. So the son here, the weight of office on his face. I mean, I think that's really remarkable. This is a man who takes this very seriously. Just let's talk about something else. I think all of us were very nervous about what might happen in terms of protests and people possibly disrupting the coronation. I said earlier that HMS Diamond, which is our most advanced warship, is sitting in Greenwich because they took it that seriously in terms of the threat posed. Now, we also know that the Met did crack down very hard yesterday on Republic. It cracked down on Extinction Rebellion and all the rest of them. MPs and human rights group, or some of them, are now criticising the Met Police and saying that they were incredibly heavy-handed. Do you see it like that, Charlie?
Well, so I said this on Andre Walker's show last night, right? So there's part of me, there's the liberal streak in me that thinks people should be, they should be allowed to protest. It's a democratic right, this, that, and the other. Then there's the absolutist in me. Then there's the deep English spirit that says crush them. Crush these Republicans.
Isn't it more? You are quite draconian when you get going. I know. I mean, I totally agree about the freedom of speech thing, but Jonathan, just in terms of the Met's response, and they have said they acted in a proportionate manner. Look, there were serious concerns. They knew that people were trying to cause trouble, obviously, and Graham Smith, who is the head of Republic, obviously was arrested, kept for 16 hours in custody. One might argue that's a bit long, but well, you can say that. But just in terms of that, they have said, the Met has been very clear, it is a once-in-a-lifetime event. We had to do that. And actually, surely they should ensure the safety of the onlookers, the vast majority of people who were there, to enjoy themselves and to witness history.
No, the role of the police is to enforce the safety of the onlookers. That is true. However, I think it is so important in this country that we have a freedom to protest and a freedom to, speak. And even if I could disagree with him, I'm not a Republican, I'm a monarchist, we should be able able to, as long as, they're not using violent means, they're doing it peacefully. And in some cases, they told the police beforehand. We saw, for example, at the Queen's funeral, when the lawyer was literally just holding up a blank card and he got arrested. There have been cases prior in which, there has been unduly force which has been used by the police.
But let's put it the other way around. Imagine if something had happened and we'd allowed protesters, etc., and that something had happened as a result. The public would have been an absolute outcry.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. And I think what we need is clarity. What we need to work at is why did that happen at that moment? Because people need to understand what the rules are. There has to be a right to protest. Once you sort of throw them away, lock away, throw away the key.
I do agree.
I think that's what you need to look at is give them a right to protest, but also set the parameters. Because trust has been at an all-time low for the police. And I made the point beforehand, trust comes in on foot but leaves on horseback. And what we need to look at is that sort of mechanism. The way you do that is to get clarity. So there needs to be further explanation about why this happened in this instant, because we haven't yet had that. So people are speculating. I personally think if you're just suspecting there might be a problem, it may not be enough. What you're doing is anticipating this could be a big issue, and therefore they came in early. That's what we need better clarity on. And I suggest that the police come out very quickly and clarify that so people don't jump in with all their conspiracy.
It would be fascinating. I think the vast majority of people in this country will think they did a good job.
And they did a phenomenal job because it went seamlessly. But I do think there's this little element that could upset it if it's not dealt with early.
We need to make sure it doesn't form a precedent for, a scenario in which people can't feel like they can protest, because there were people that were arrested miles and miles away from the
So that's a great question. So therefore, the question is, if we're then shaping this framework, what should people be allowed to do?
Yes.
So I feel very passionately, you should not block the road, you should not block ambulances, you should not block people going to work.
Yeah, so, there needs to be we have a law in this country. If you're breaking the law, you get arrested,
Exactly.
It's pretty clear. It's quite clear. If, you're not sure whether someone, might have something and, there's almost no evidence for it, as I felt like there were cases with the arrest in the recent Coronation in which people were arrested, I think that is wrong. But, if you see, someone carrying a knife or a gun or whatever it is, or, acting illegally, throwing eggs at the king or whatever it is, that is not acceptable. And
it's exactly that. You need to have that clarity, saying these are the rules, this is what you've broken, this is the consequence. If you're not sure, if you haven't broken a law, that's where you lose trust in the police.
Isn't there a sort of disclaimer for yesterday? In that it was a once-in-a-lifetime event. The police were maybe overcautious, but I would prefer it that way around.
I don't think the law comes with disclaimers on that sort of basis. You have to have... The law needs to be clear. You're absolutely right. We want to do everything to make sure it went smoothly, but the law needs to be clear, and the police need to make sure the message is clear as well. They did a brilliant job yesterday. There are still some questions that need to be answered. My recommendation is to answer those questions before people step in and say they've gone too far.
Something I would like to add to this, I think, is, that we're talking about free speech and protest and that sort of thing here. Now, I would actually argue, as somebody who is proudly British and English and who loves things like yesterday, our traditions and this sort of thing, I actually don't think it's up for debate. I actually don't think it's up for debate that we have things like we had yesterday. That's how we do things in this country. That's part of our culture, has been for thousands of years. And I'm sorry, that's just the way it's going to be.
Interesting.
I disagree, because I think a part of our culture is that we're a democracy right now, and that's a changing framework. And whilst I'm a monarchist, I think, Republicans should be allowed to, express their views.
I totally agree with that.
I totally agree as well. It's nonsense to say it's not up for a debate.
I mean, Charlie's obviously going to be Justice Secretary at some point.
This country, we've got, a history of, speaking out on the streets and protesting.
Well, absolutely.
And
fighting for women's votes, for example, Emily Pankhurst and all that. So all of that is really important, and I absolutely agree. Let's move on and talk about something that's really been overshadowed, really, the local election results. Because, I mean, it is extraordinary. People have forgotten that we had local elections. Turnout was pretty abysmal across the board. But however you spin this, it's not great for Labour, is it? And it's an absolute nightmare for the Tories.
Yeah, well, I mean, Tories lose 1,000 seats, Labour gain 400. I mean, that doesn't scream landslide general election victory to me.
No, absolutely. And, of course, the Conservatives were already at a, well, not all-time low, but they were certainly low, weren't they, in 2019?
Well, it shows you that it's people. I don't think there really are that many people in this country who are virulently pro-Labour. Obviously, there are some, but I think that a vote for Labour in the local elections, or Lib Dem for that matter, it's a vote against the Tories as opposed to being in favour of those two parties.
So the least worst for some people, maybe.
Yeah, it is that. But then there's still plenty of time to the next general election, and I really do think the Tories can. I'm not saying I want this because I don't support the party in the slightest, but I think they can turn it around. Based on this election.
So that's really interesting. Just in terms of the Conservative Party, I think they're going to. I mean, they're spinning it that it was a triumph.
Yes.
But I
somehow.
I mean,
good day for bad news.
Exactly. So they were jolly pleased there was a coronation.
Absolutely.
But just in terms of this, does this act as a wake-up call to the Conservatives, or is it actually that in local elections people don't vote as they would nationally? I said earlier, it's about potholes. It's about actually libraries being open. It's about the environment you're in, whether you've got trees, whether you've got buses.
Look, there is an element of that. I would say you cannot avoid, unfortunately, the national framework and what's happening in the way that is having some influence. I agree in some respects that the Labour gains are in part because of the Conservatives' own failures. I would say it's also potentially due to Labour sort of rebranding their party in a very different light, where it used to be. But I do think as well that council votes are different. There is a long time to go still before a general election, and a lot can happen. I think Rishi Sunak was probably aware, I'd hope so, that there was a lot of problems within the Conservative Party prior to these council elections, and that's why he basically tried to completely ignore it. And Oliver Dowden said, if we don't lose 1,000 seats, it will be, okay. Which is just, what sort of a standard is that assessing? It's ridiculous.
Well, absolutely right. And of course, you see, in terms of Rishi Sunak, it's very interesting. He has these 5 points behind him the whole time now.
Yes.
I mean, talk about being hoisted by your own petard. I mean, if he doesn't deliver those, the electorate will say, well, you didn't do that there. I'm not voting.
But they're easy to deliver, aren't they? I mean, this is the whole
votes. They haven't done a very good job.
Well, no, but it's interesting that you're doing certain sort of things, and it's like inflation, getting inflation down or whatever. All the experts were predicting it's going to be much better than that sort of base. I mean, you were saying earlier, we touched on this with Charlie, is that you're turning around and saying that they can turn it around within the time. What do they need to do?
That's hard. I mean, I think stopping the boats is a big one because it's such a visible and visceral problem that it feels so wrong.
Yeah, you come here on a boat, you're stuck in a hotel, you have better circumstances than actually people who are struggling and can't actually afford to go shopping in Tesco or any other supermarket.
Well, homeless veterans, to use the absolute stereotype.
Yeah.
I think that's probably, for a lot of people, number one. Now, beyond that, there are certain things like certain economic things. Now, I'm not an economist, but to me, it certainly looks like this is a ship that's going to be very difficult to right. And I think that whoever was in power, it would kind of the economic decline we're seeing would be happening regardless. It's just, I suppose the Tories need to put a brave face on it.
So what is very interesting, and I looked at the map this morning at some very early hour this morning, but the Conservatives have lost that red wall. So the Northwest particularly, I was an MEP for the Northwest, so they need to regain those people who believed in Brexit, actually. And I think that's underpinning this is another, it's just disillusionment. Now, I use this expression about managed decline. It feels like, apart from yesterday, which was marvellous, but managed decline, and someone needs to show some vision, don't they?
Well, I think Keira's put a lot of emphasis on, returning Brexit-backing Britain, as he called it, to Labour.
I'm not sure I believe him.
Well, he's done a pretty good job of it, to be fair, in the local council elections. You've got Plymouth, Stoke, Swansea, I think, as well. You can't see he's not doing an effective job. He doesn't want to.
Well, he's detoxified the party, hasn't he, as well?
He's done that. I think he's made it potentially much less hard left, particularly both economically, socially. On Brexit, he's saying we will support Brexit. He's saying, I think his approach to immigration is slightly different in a sense, and more what I'm aligned to potentially, which is that I think that one of the biggest problems is the backlog. It's not so much, the people that we're letting in. It's more that you've got a massive backlog.
I think 140,000 or those.
Yeah, it's huge.
It's absolutely enormous.
They're not allowed to work, right? Which I think is ridiculous. They're literally being housed, obviously, in tax-paying hotels. I don't think they're particularly luxurious or nice, as might be framed, but still it costs money, obviously. And so I think the fault lies with the Home Office.
So what's the solution? Because that's what people say, but it's easy to identify the problem. What you need to look at is the solution. What is the solution?
Okay, so in my opinion, if I was Home Secretary, firstly, you need much better processing patterns, and I think that comes with, firstly, actually making immigration and gaining immigration status easier and more accessible to people, because at the moment there are people who have been waiting for 4 years to gain immigration status. It's beyond a joke, and that's costing every year the taxpayer money. So that's the first thing, sorting the backlog, having a more transparent system, having maybe, a minimum or maximum number of people that you can have, ensuring that we're, getting people that we particularly need to fill particular jobs, because we do have in a lot of sectors not enough people for the jobs, and all the companies have made this incredibly clear. It's really affecting our economy, and we need to find a solution. And obviously it'd be fantastic to get more Britons working, but we still can use immigrants and have been using immigrants for many years to great effect to support our economy, whether, through healthcare, whether through in corporations, and I think, that needs to continue.
Just very quickly, if I may, so Keir Starmer has also put housing into this. I don't know if you saw this morning. I mean, he says he'll reintroduce housing targets. There's no doubt in my mind that housing is a huge electoral issue. Young people, like yourselves, to get on the housing ladder, I don't know how you're going to do it, to be honest.
Yeah, it's quite a scary prospect, to be honest. I mean, I really do think that conservatives like myself need to understand that
small c conservatives.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. When it comes to economics, the priority must always be the manoeuvring of private property into the hands of young people who want to start families.
100%.
Because you can't. I really don't think it's that possible to start a family without owning property. And so instead of this just endless drive towards growth,
but that's interesting, because the Europeans don't buy properties. They tend to rent them.
Yeah.
So you can start a family, but isn't the aspiration that everyone should be able to buy?
That's exactly right, and I think that would be a great positive vision for young people. If they did have the prospect of buying a house. Now, on the idea of housing targets and this sort of thing, I would add that yes, it's an important issue, but we are not at replacement birth rate in this country. For example, the indigenous population is not, and yet our population continues to grow, and this is because of mass legal immigration. So at the end of the day, I don't know what it's like where you all live, but around where I'm from in Kent, the fields and the rolling plains and forests of the shires are being paved over by identical housing developments.
So that's
the house forests,
and that I'm seeing in Suffolk as well. Which actually a lot of people are very, very upset about. It will be a massive electoral issue, I think. Also, there are 1,000. I think there's room for 1.2 million homes on brownfield sites.
1.4, I thought it was.
Fine, a lot of houses. 1.4 million.
Tons.
Why aren't we building them?
I think it was ridiculous, and I was very angry actually at the article that I saw this morning by Theresa Villiers was saying, we should actually protect the green belt, protect these rural areas.
I saw that.
It made me very, very angry because, firstly, a lot of the green belt is actually simply not green or environmental. It's literally to protect urban sprawl, and so it just means people develop in other areas. It massively increases inequality, in that a lot of it is privately owned rather than being able to build on it. It's young people like ourselves are not able to get property. We're not able to, even renting is incredibly expensive in London.
Sure.
And
but that's the problem, isn't it? Because then the solution is not just building the houses, you've got to be able to afford to do it. You've got issues such as things like inheritance tax, which actually most people are property rich and cash poor.
Absolutely. But also the thing is also elderly people. I said this the other week, and I had some kickback. But I know that some elderly people who want to move can't actually afford to move, and they're in houses that are far too big that we need to liberate for young families. Actually, that's really important.
I'd just like to add very quickly. The point that I'm driving at here is the conversation is always around the supply side. So it's about supplying enough houses. Whereas I would prefer to have a conversation about demand side, because demand is upstream from supply, and demand is coming from mass legal immigration.
No, there's massive demand. We have massive demand, but the solution to that is increasing supply, in my opinion. It's not decreasing.
But why not decrease demand?
Because we already have tons of demand, both from young people itself.
But why not decrease it if we can?
No, but it's not. It's also not just supply and demand. It's the ability to afford it. I think if you can't, it's no good if there's lots of houses and they're £1 million if you're in the centre of London. You just can't do it. And I think that's the reality.
And we can
you need to look at that
houses.
solution.
Exactly.
Yeah, build more, but you don't want to also devalue the property market.
And I think there's one other point, which is we need the infrastructure. You need schools, you need hospitals, you need transport, and we simply aren't doing that. The way we build in this country, I think, is frankly ridiculous. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. Jonathan Gibson, Charlie Downs, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Time for a break.